Well, welcome back as we look at the 18th century and address the situation in the church there in this particular period. As I mentioned last time, there were two significant events that took place in the 18th century which would affect the church. That was the Union of 1707, when Scotland and England came together, government based at Westminster. And with that came the 1712 Patronage Act, despite the fact that the Presbyterians in Scotland had been promised that they could keep their precious Christian democratic process. It was actually completely thrown down just 5 years later. And so what happened was a local landowner who was wealthy would choose the pastor of, and that way the democratic system was completely thrown aside, and he could choose somebody who was the most liberal person possible. So you had a choice in those days. If you really wanted to follow Jesus and obey the Bible, you stayed there and inwardly groaned, or you left to try and find somewhere else. So that was the backdrop there in this particular time, in the beginning of the early 1700s. And then the church, we find a split starts to happen. Because of this Patronage Act, it opened up the door for a flow of compromise and liberalism into the church, and we find a division growing between what are known as the moderates, who are the compromisers, and the high flyers, who are the traditional or evangelical Christians. I mentioned the last time that there were many pastors, churches, they kept petitioning the government to have their freedom to practice a Presbyterian church properly, but they were just ignored. And so 21 years later, two brothers, pastors called Ebenezer Erskine and Ralph Erskine, they break away with a few other pastors. There's an evangelical movement called the Secessionist Church, and there's actually quite a revival breaks out amongst them as they preach openly. That is one of the breakthrough groups and the breakaway groups you find in the Presbyterian Church in that period. Well, the moderates, deism flowed into Scotland from England and France. And among the leading moderates in Edinburgh were the Reverend William Robertson, who was the senior minister at Greyfriars Kirk in Edinburgh. And he was also the principal of Edinburgh University. And he declared that miracles are now ceased. So he very much followed that. Another leading voice was the Reverend Dugald Stewart, who was a philosopher who called Edinburgh the Athens of the North. And if you go to Edinburgh these days in the Old Town, you see all those mock Greek buildings from the 18th century, early 1800s that rose up, reflecting the philosophy that was going on at the time. There was a man called Reverend John Hume, the playwright, and as a pastor, he wrote Douglas, which caused a big stir in the city of Edinburgh, and he ended up having to go and live in Covent Garden and in London. Another one of the ministers was the Reverend Hugh Blair, who had quite an influence, and the Reverend Jupiter, that was his nickname, Carlyle, who actually, they reckon he said he looked like Zeus in the paintings and the statues, his flowing beard. So these were some of the ringleaders of the liberal movement. And in the midst of all this, there came out of what was called the happiness gospel, which is not quite what maybe we would think about happiness. We might think, oh, let's all be happy and have a wonderful time. It didn't mean that at all. See, there was this chap, the Reverend Francis Hutchinson, who was one of the key pioneers of the Enlightenment in Scotland. And he was a professor of moral philosophy at Glasgow University between 1729 and 1746. His influence was enormous in Edinburgh and far beyond into Europe and America. In response to what could often be a dour, rigid religiosity amongst some of his fellow clergy, he emphasised beauty, happiness, liberty, moral virtue, tolerance and love. Long before the French were crying out for liberty, equality and fraternity, he was calling for these Christian values in Scotland. Drawing from both the classical philosophers and the Christian faith, he diffused his message of moral happiness through his speaking and writing, particularly through his system of moral philosophy. He wrote in one of his Dublin essays that all men of reflection from the age of Socrates have sufficiently proved that the truest, most constant and lively pleasure, the happiest enjoyment of life, consists in kind affections to our fellow creatures. In other words, to love your neighbour as yourself. This is the best form of happiness, rather than to be selfish. Now, some of the high flyers, or the evangelicals, scorned him at times as being one of the liberal new lights, as they said. But thoughtful people realized that he was bringing to our culture something that was needed. The stereotypical Calvinist of the time would look at himself as a wretched sinner, a poor worm. Hutcheson emphasized that because we are made in the image of God, we should have a positive attitude and celebrate this by loving our neighbour as ourselves, or as Christ said, it is more blessed to give than to receive. For the depressed disciples of the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who considered mankind to be drenched and inundated with selfishness and incapable of any good, there was some cheer in the air. It was not that Hutcheson lived in a naive bubble, for he was fully aware of human sin and wickedness. And he was seeking to highlight the idea that if we find security and happiness in God, then this is shown by acts of kindness, which in turn multiplies happiness in the world. The influence of Reverend Francis Hutcheson can be seen in the memorable line of the American Declaration of Independence penned by Thomas Jefferson, which adds the pursuit of happiness to its inalienable rights of man. His adoring student Adam Smith called him the never-to-be-forgotten Dr. Hutcheson. And even though Smith remained a deist, his emulation of his mentor was shown by the fact that after he died, his many hitherto disguised acts of charity became known to the people of the city. Another Christian at this time who began to challenge the status quo was the philosopher Thomas Reid, who was another pastor, the Reverend Thomas Reid, professor of moral philosophy at the University of Glasgow, was in a great position to challenge David Hume on his own turf. And so this debate went on. David Hume's philosophy and Thomas Reid's philosophy, the common sense philosophy, which became known as the School of Common Sense. Not only did Thomas Reid pioneer this common sense philosophy, but he was also the co-founder of the famous Royal Society of Edinburgh in 1783. He had a big influence, not just only in Scotland, but abroad in Europe and especially in America. And in fact, there's even been a revival of this common sense philosophy amongst some of the debaters and thinkers in that great nation there. So, if Hume's rationalism meant that you could not believe something exists unless you had scientific proof for it, then Reid's attitude was that we have been given 5 senses so that we can actually know by common sense whether something exists. For example, Hume might need brick samples to prove whether a house exists, but Reid would be convinced that a house exists if we could touch it and see it for ourselves. And so this obviously appealed to a lot of people who couldn't get into the depths of philosophy, and it made far more sense to the average person. Now, the second main group, as I've mentioned, the moderates or the liberals, these were the evangelicals. And among the leaders of this group were the Reverend Alexander Webster and the Reverend Dr. John Witherspoon, who was the first principal when he went to Princeton University in America, and was a leading voice for American independence when he was there. I've also mentioned the Reverends Ebenezer and Ralph Erskine, who were brothers, and the Reverend Dr. John Erskine, who was different, he was not connected with them. These became the driving force in Scotland behind world mission, actually, and distribution of Christian literature. Something more than a radical happiness gospel needed to happen in Edinburgh and Scotland, because something had to happen to change the sinners, to transform them, and that would be the revolutionary power of the preaching of the gospel. So there were 2 key figures that appeared in Scotland at this time. That was George Whitefield and John Wesley. They were both Englishmen, Anglican preachers, but they were welcomed in Scotland. And this was a sign of actual desperation from the evangelicals in Edinburgh, that they had actually asked the English to come and help them. It shows you how desperate the situation really was. So in 1742, a human fireball hit Scotland. This is the Reverend George Whitefield, and he came hurtling from his successful open-air preaching revivals in England to Cambuslang near Glasgow. A memorial there, placed by the Friends of Cambuslang Park, was erected in March 2008. It says, "The Preaching Braes, site of the Cambuslang Walk, or the Work, the great religious revival of 1742. In this place of the Methodist evangelist George Whitefield led congregations of many thousands in prayer and worship." Now, Whitefield was a Church of England clergyman at the time, and having been converted to Christ in 1735 through reading the Life of God in the Soul of Man by the Scottish Puritan Henry Scougal, a professor at Aberdeen University, he found that since 1738 there was a great hunger in England for the crowds who flocked to hear him in the open air. Soon the high flyers, the traditionists and the evangelicals in Scotland were calling for him to come up north. And the summer of 1741 he came to Edinburgh for a 13-week preaching tour through the invitation of the brothers, the Reverend Ralph and Reverend Ebenezer Erskine of the Succession Church. He recounts the experience he had in August in that year in Edinburgh. He said, "Every morning I have a constant levy of wounded souls. At 7 in the morning we have a lecture in the fields, attended not only by the common people but by persons of great rank. I have reason to think several of the latter sort are coming to Jesus. Congregations consist of many thousands. Never did I see so many Bibles, nor people just looking into them when I am expounding with such attention. I preach twice daily and expound at private houses at night, and am employed in speaking to souls under distress a great part of the day." On the 24th of September, he was stunned by what was happening. He records that on Thursday evening, I preached to the children of the city with a congregation of near 20,000 in the park. And this actually was in the grounds of what's called the George Heriot School near Greyfriars Kirk. The work amongst the pupils in Edinburgh was extraordinary in this particular boarding school. And Edward Anderson, who was an eyewitness teacher at the time, wrote a letter to Whitefield expressing his amazement after his preaching. And he said, "Our boys seem to be in love with their Bibles and to delight in prayer. I have frequently taken course through their rooms at 10 and 11 o'clock at night and found great numbers in raptures of devotion. This is their constant practice every day. The elder boys teach the young ones to pray, not only by example, but also by advice and instruction. They abhor vice. The other hospitals or schools, and they live now in great friendship and love, delighting to talk of the goodness of God to lost sinners, whereas formerly they were too often falling out. Heriot's Hospital, or this is a school we call George Heriot, is now no more a den of vicious boys, but a Bethel, for there God is worshipped." And that's quite extraordinary to think what was going on in the grounds, these 20,000 young people hearing the gospel being preached, and the movement of God that was skipping from school to school as these boys were sharing the message of Jesus, and that spread through the communities of the schools in our city. Well, as Whitefield preached, it seemed that Scotland, as with England and the colonies of America, was in the grip of a religious revival, with thousands becoming Christians. It is not surprising that he had opposition, with James Cordero Wilson calling him a zealous, pig-eyed English quack. While Whitefield's famous revival gathering of about 30,000 at Cambuslang witnessed many deep emotional expressions, including shaking, swooning, and crying out, as the people came under the conviction of sin and turned to Christ. The moderates tended to scorn the meetings as much as the Enlightenment set. But Alison Coburn could despairingly write to her friend David Hume, "The drinking dens are empty, and everyone has gone after Whitefield and Wesley." William Smollett, the writer, exclaimed, "Imposture and fanaticism still hang upon the skirts of religion. Weak minds were seduced by the delusions of a superstition-styled Methodism. Many thousands were infected with this enthusiasm by the endeavours of a few obscure preachers such as Whitefield and the Wesleys. However, it was later on he realised the lasting effects for good moral character that caused William Smollett to change his mind, and he actually became a supporter in the end of this movement. The Reverend Sidney Smith of the Edinburgh Review could use heavily laden words and phrases such as fanatics or lunacy and a conspiracy against common sense and rational Orthodox Christianity. Even those among the high flyers joined in the attack with the Reverend Adam Gibb, an eminent pastor from Edinburgh, shooting a broadside at Whitefield with a long titled pamphlet warning people not to attend the meeting because they were scandalous and diabolical. The Cameronians, who had been famous during the time of the Covenanters, also had a go at George Whitefield and called him a limb of Antichrist. Even the Reverend Ralph Erskine, one of the brothers who had first invited him to Scotland a year before the Cambuslang revival, ended up denouncing him, which is so sad when you think, because they focused on the emotionalism as people were crying out to God for mercy to be forgiven of their sins. Any signs of emotionalism were disregarded, and for that reason the Whitefield tended to be regarded as a fanatical kind of preacher. You would think that Whitefield, with all that abuse and betrayal, would have packed up his bags and returned to England. Instead, he kept coming 14 times between 1741 and 1768. He let the changed lives and results speak for themselves. Besides this, whilst the moderates were debating their philosophies in polite society over a bottle of French claret, he was pragmatically collecting money to have the Royal Infirmary built to care for the sick in Edinburgh, and for schools and orphanages in Britain and America. The second person who had a big impact was the Reverend John Wesley, the Lionheart preacher. He was a small man, but he had a really bold preaching style. Now, he preached in Scotland 22 times between 1751 and 1790. In the early years of his open-air gatherings on Colton Hill, Castle Hill, Arthur's Seat, and in the schoolyards, crowds of between 5,000 and 6,000 would regularly turn up to hear him preach, even at 5 o'clock in the morning, which is extraordinary when you think about it, before they went to work. He remembered the time on Colton Hill in 1764 when, during a Sabbath communion, he witnessed the largest crowd he'd ever seen in Scotland. And more importantly, he said, they were deeply affected. Many were in tears. More seemed cut to the heart. Surely, he wrote in his journal, this time will not be forgotten. Will it not appear in the annals of eternity? Despite his passionate preaching and large crowds, however, Wesley never really broke through in Scotland. On his death, he left only just over 1,000 people in the Wesleyan Connection, the Methodist Church, compared with the 57,000 in England and Wales. Although he wrote in 1788 that he could find a frankness and openness in the people of Edinburgh which I find in few other parts of the kingdom, he also found that they hear but feel no more than the seats they sit upon. What he soon discovered was how deeply entrenched Calvinism was in the people, and he was an Arminian, so he was preaching about the free choice to turn to Christ. And for that reason, so many of those who were converted through his preaching remained within the Church of Scotland, and not so many into the newly formed Methodist churches. John Calvin and his followers had taught that God had predetermined people to go to heaven or hell, whereas the Arminians taught that we have free will to choose God or reject him. Although many people turned out to hear Wesley's preaching, it was his Arminian views which screened most of them from being members of the Methodist congregations. This was something that both his brother Charles and fellow evangelist and Calvinist friend George Whitefield had warned him about in Scotland. Another problem was the level of education and knowledge he found in Edinburgh, and he ruefully admitted they know everything, so they learn nothing. He soon realised that he had a battle on his hands with the Calvinists, led primarily by the very man who had done so much good in Britain and America, John Erskine. After Erskine had published his Mr. Wesley's Principles Detected in 1767, Wesley found a growing aloofness from the clergy, and yet both were godly men of love. Benjamin Rush, the evangelical from America, could write of Erskine that the fire of Christian love burned upon the altar of his heart with a perpetual blaze. Wesley, in turn, could say about Erskine, "I love your person, I love your character, I love the work wherein you are engaged." There was a time when a Calvinist Christian asked the preacher George Whitefield about John Wesley. And he asked a question: "Do you think we shall see John Wesley in heaven?" once inquired an over-aggressive Calvinist of Whitefield. "I fear not," replied the fellow evangelist, musing. "No, he will be so near to the throne, and we at such a distance, that we should hardly get a sight of him." And that would show the reaction of his friend. There was a Calvinist and an Arminian preaching the gospel, standing for the most important thing, the salvation of souls and the glory of God. And they could coexist even though they had a different point of view about free will and predestination, which sadly so many of the ministers lost when they argued about this subject. Well, Wesley tried so hard to see a unity forged between him and the Presbyterians, even finding Lady Glenorchy and Lady Maxwell to fund and support a gospel partnership. Lady Glenorchy wrote in her diary on the 7th of March in 1770, "This day St. Mary's Chapel was opened in Edinburgh for preaching the gospel. Ministers of every denomination are to be admitted who have a sincere love to the Lord Jesus Christ and the souls of men, and who preach the doctrine of justification by faith alone." Sadly, this experiment was only a watershed moment in our history, and it could have been a real breakthrough, with unity between the church denominations in Edinburgh and Scotland for a great movement of God. But it was hijacked because of the Calvinist opposition. And Wesley's hopes were high, but were soon dashed to pieces. By 1771, after listening to some of the leading Calvinists in Edinburgh, Lady Glenorchy dismissed Mr. Wesley's preachers from her chapel. Such a failed experiment may have been a crushing blow to Wesley and others, but something was stirring. A new day was dawning in which the Presbyterian Christians would one day work side by side with Christians of other church denominations in love and harmony for Christ's gospel. But this would emerge during the next century, in the 19th century. It will be like a giant arising from a long sleep with global consequences. And one of the things which came out of this movement in the 18th century actually came through the Reverend John Erskine, who had opposed John Wesley. Erskine saw the impact of the gospel personally in 1742. He threw in his law career to become a Presbyterian pastor and shared the pulpit with the liberal Reverend William Robertson at Greyfriars Kirk in Edinburgh. Erskine became passionate for prayer, revival and world mission. He pioneered the prayer concerts, as they were called, in Scotland in the 1740s, and he was stirring people all the time to prayer for a Christian revival in Scotland and to pray for an awakening of the people back to God in Scotland. And this movement, this network of Presbyterian pastors spread through Scotland, and it was preparing the way for a massive work that would come later. He then began to turn his attention to America, and he had strong connections over there. So he wrote a pamphlet called Memorial, which was basically outlining how to pray for revival and awakening. And 500 copies were sent to Boston over there in the States. The Reverend Jonathan Edwards was deeply inspired by it. He'd already seen a revival as a Congregationalist pastor. But he was so inspired by this pamphlet by John Erskine that he wrote a book called An Humble Attempt to Promote Explicit Agreement and Visible Union of God's People in Extraordinary Prayer for the Revival of Religion and the Advancement of Christ's Kingdom on Earth, pursuant to Scripture promises and prophecies concerning the last time. What a long title. So we just call it An Humble Attempt. And that was 1747. And the result of that book that Edwards wrote spread like wildfire amongst the pastors and churches on both sides of the Atlantic, and a great revival broke out as a result. So what we see is prayer movements and revival movements both in Britain and America, and Erskine from Edinburgh having a significant impact on that. In 1796, Erskine challenged the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland in Edinburgh to obey Christ's calling for a world mission with his famous words, "Moderator, rax me that Bible," or that book. Rax meaning pass. And you see, the moderates said that the responsibility of the church was only to teach good manners, to make people polite, and to feed and clothe and educate the poor. And that was it. And the minority of evangelicals were getting frustrated. They say, of course we need to do that, but we need to preach the gospel which converts the soul and transforms our culture. And we need to take the gospel to the nations. So it was the Reverend John Erskine who challenged them in the assembly, particularly from Acts 28 in the Bible, to preach the gospel to the barbarians. It was a watershed moment for Scotland's world mission. Before this, world mission from Scotland was sparse, and there hadn't been much. There'd been the SSPCK, the Scottish Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge, had been founded in 1701 and given the Royal Charter in 1709, and a few other mission societies, but it was a small kind of movement. But due to the tireless work of John Erskine, what we see is world mission vision starts to erupt from our capital city and spread through Scotland. And out of that, first of all, dozens of Scottish missionaries would sprout up at home, and missionaries eventually by the hundreds would be sent out to the nations. Besides this, Erskine was a great inspirer and disseminator of Christian literature for equipping the saints. Thomas Nelson's publishers began on the Royal Mile in Edinburgh in 1798 and went on to become the world's leading Christian publisher. They're based in America these days. Erskine sent many books through them to the needy leaders in Britain, Europe and America. He was equipping the fledgling American universities for their theological libraries. And so if you look in some of the older books in the American universities from the 18th, 19th century, it's coming from Edinburgh, it's coming from Glasgow. They're equipping the American universities with good Christian books. And so what we also find is that John Erskine has a big impact also on the Reverend Jonathan Edwards. I've already mentioned that. But when Jonathan Edwards died, people looked into his personal library and found about a third of his books had been sent to him by Erskine from Edinburgh. So what we see in this 18th century movement, we see a revival, we see thousands coming to Christ, we see especially the powerful preaching of Whitefield and Wesley, who were quite happy to work together even though they had different understandings of predestination and free will. But sadly we saw a Calvinist, a strict Calvinist point of view which got in the way, and what could have been a powerful movement that would have gone on far bigger than it did in the 18th century was held back by those attitudes, sadly. And it would not be till the next century that what Wesley and Whitefield hoped for would really break out in such power and not only just impact Scotland in the greatest revivals we'd ever seen, but also the world as a result.